I sat in that sterile conference room, the kind with too much glass and not enough warmth, staring at the polished table as if it might tell me something. My hands were folded in my lap, still, like they'd forgotten how to move. My son-in-law stood at the head of the table, all crisp suit and practiced confidence, his voice sharp as he read from the will. Beatrice Langley, he said, pausing just long enough to make my heart skip, is not included in the distribution of Walter's $62 million estate. $62 million, Walter's life's work, our life's work, reduced to a number, and my name, nowhere in it. I didn't cry. I didn't have any tears left. For months, I'd sat by Walter's hospital bed, holding his hand through the pain, the machines, the endless nights when his breathing was the only sound in the room. I'd been his anchor, his partner, his everything through the founding of his charity, through the sleepless nights planning fundraisers, through the quiet evenings when we'd sit on our porch, dreaming of the lives we'd touch. And now, Theo was telling the room, telling me I didn't exist. I looked around, hoping someone would say something, anything. But the lawyers just shuffled their papers, and the other faces, strangers in suits, voided my eyes. Theo handed me a small wooden box, his fingers brushing mine for a second, cold and fleeting. "Walter wanted you to have this," he said, his tone flat, like he was handing me a receipt. Inside was Walter's old fountain pen, the one he used to scribble notes during board meetings. No letter, no note, just a pen. A relic of a life I thought I'd shared. I closed the box and held it against my chest, like it could hold me together. The funeral had been 3 days earlier. Theo planned every detail, carnations in neat rows, a slideshow timed to the second, a speech that sounded like it was written for a press release. It was perfect, the way a magazine ad is perfect, beautiful, but hollow. Walter would have hated it. He always said funerals should be raw, messy, full of stories and laughter through tears. But this one felt like a performance, one I hadn't been invited to star in. I stood in our garden afterward, watching the last guests drive away, their headlights fading into the dusk. No one thought to ask if I needed a ride, not even Theo. When I stepped back into the house, the silence was louder than ever. The air still smelled of Walter's coffee, the kind he brewed every morning, strong and bitter. His bookshelf stood untouched, lined with novels he'd read a dozen times. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, dog-eared pages, marked with his thoughts. But something had shifted. The house we'd built together, the home where we'd laughed and argued and planned a legacy, didn't feel like mine anymore. It was as if my name had been quietly erased from every wall, every corner. I sat at the kitchen table that night, the fountain pen still in its box beside me. I ran my fingers over the wood, tracing the grain, trying to find something of Walter in it, but all I could feel was the weight of being left behind. Theo hadn't just taken the money. He'd taken the story of us, rewritten it to leave me out. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was clouding my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just grief. There was a coldness in the air, a kind of absence I couldn't name. Have you ever stood in a place you've known your whole life and felt like a stranger? That's what I felt that night, like I was a guest in my own home, a footnote in a story someone else was writing. I didn't know it then, but that was just the beginning. Something was coming, something that would change everything. And it started with a laugh, a lawyer's laugh that I wouldn't hear until later. The email came late on a Tuesday, the kind of gray evening where the rain taps the windows like it's trying to get your attention. It was from Theo's assistant, not even from him. The subject line read, "Estate administration meeting scheduled. No greeting, no hope, you're doing okay. B. Just a date, a time, and an address downtown," like I was being summoned to a dentist appointment. I stared at the screen, my tea growing cold in its mug. Part of me wanted to delete it, to pretend it never arrived, but something heavier knot in my chest told me I had to go. The meeting was at the charity's office, a sleek building, with glass walls and air that smelled of fresh paint and ambition. I arrived early, my coat still damp from the drizzle, and sat at the far end of a long conference table. Theo was already there, standing at the head like a general, his tie perfectly knotted, his eyes scanning a stack of folders. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just nodded, barely, like I was an afterthought. The room filled with people I didn't know, lawyers, board members, their faces blank, as they sipped coffee from matching mugs. I was the only one without a folder, without a pen, without a place in the script. Theo cleared his throat. As executor of Walter's estate, he began, his voice smooth, professional. I'll outline the distribution of assets as per the finalized will." He spoke like he was addressing a boardroom, not a widow. He listed properties, investments, the charities, endowment things Walter and I had built together over decades. Then he said it, so casually it felt like a slap. "Walter transferred control of the family trust to me a year ago." I froze. That couldn't be right. Walter and I had managed that trust together since the day we started the charity. Every decision, every dollar, we'd discussed over coffee at our kitchen table, his hand brushing mine, as we planned. He never mentioned giving it to Theo, not once. I wanted to speak, to ask what he meant, but my voice stayed trapped in my throat. Theo kept talking, listing allocations like he was reading a grocery list. My name never came up, not a single time. When the meeting ended, the others filed out, their briefcases clicking shut, their voices low. Theo stayed behind, packing his papers with precision. He glanced at me, just for a second, and said, "If you have any questions, my assistant can schedule a call." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the hum of the air conditioner. I walked out into the rain, my scarf pulled tight, feeling like I'd just watched my life be folded into someone else's briefcase. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too full of Walter's absence. I wandered into his study, a small room at the back of the house where he used to work late. His glasses perched on his nose, a pencil tucked behind his ear. The desk was still cluttered with his things, old receipts, a coffee-stained notebook, a stack of charity reports. I wasn't looking for anything specific. My hands just moved, pulling open drawers, as if they knew something I didn't. In the bottom drawer, under a pile of yellowed papers, I found a small leather notebook, the kind Walter carried everywhere. I opened it, my fingers trembling. His handwriting filled the pages, shaky but unmistakable. One entry, dated 6 months before he passed, stopped me cold. "Theo wants to revise the will," it read. "Says it's for clarity, to simplify things." I asked why now. He said it's best for the charity. I'm not sure. Haven't told B. She'd ask too many questions, and I don't have answers. I read it again, then again, the words blurring as my eyes stung. Walter had doubts. He'd sensed something was wrong, but he hadn't told me. Why? To protect me, or because he didn't trust himself to face it. I turned the page and found a draft of an older will, one I recognized. It listed me as the primary beneficiary, our home, the trust, a fund for the charity's future. But there, in red ink, my name was crossed out. In the margin, Walter had scribbled, "Discuss with Theo." I closed the notebook, my hands steady now, but my heart racing. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Theo hadn't just taken the money. He'd taken Walter's trust, twisted it, and left me out of the story we'd written together. I sat there in the dark, the notebook in my lap, and for the first time since Walter's death, I felt something sharper than grief. It was anger, quiet but growing, like an ember waiting for air. Have you ever found a secret that changed the way you saw someone you loved? That's what that notebook was for me, a crack in the story I thought I knew. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Theo write the ending. Not without a fight. The morning after I found Walter's notebook, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't just grief anymore, or even anger. It was purpose. That scribbled note in Walter's shaky hand had lit something inside me, a quiet fire that wouldn't let me sit still. I couldn't undo his absence, but I could protect what we'd built together. I could make sure his story, our story, wasn't rewritten by someone else's pen. I knew I couldn't do this alone, so I called Ellen Foster. Ellen had been the charity's accountant for years, back when Walter and I were still dreaming it up over late-night coffee. She was in her late 60s now, sharp as ever, with a laugh that could fill a room and a memory for numbers that never missed a beat. When I told her what happened at the will reading, her voice went quiet. "B," she said, after a long pause, "that doesn't sound like Walter. Let's dig into this." We met at a small diner the next day, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since dawn. Ellen slid into the seat across from me, her coat still speckled with rain. I handed her the notebook, open to Walter's note about Theo. She read it slowly, her brow furrowing, her fingers tracing the red ink where my name had been crossed out. "This isn't right," she said, her voice low but firm. "Walter would have told you if he was changing something this big. He trusted you with everything." Ellen suggested we start with the will itself. She knew someone who could help Tomas, Tom Bennett, a retired lawyer who'd spent decades untangling messy estate disputes. Tom was in his 70s, with a calm demeanor and eyes that seemed to see through people. I met him at his office, a small space downtown cluttered with books and files. I brought the notebook and the draft will, laying them out like evidence in a trial I didn't yet understand. Tom leaned back in his chair, reading Walter's words carefully. When he got to the part about Theo wanting to simplify things, he shook his head. "This smells like manipulation," he said plainly. "We need to check the signatures on the final will." Tom's first step was to pull the certified copy of the will from the county records. It didn't take long for him to spot something off. The witness signatures, two names I'd never heard of, weren't from anyone Walter knew. He'd always used friends or colleagues for things like this, people we'd had over for dinner, people who'd golfed with him on Sundays. These names, strangers. "That's a red flag," Tom said, scribbling notes. "We'll need to verify if they were even present when Walter signed." Back home, I couldn't stop moving. I went to Walter's study again, driven by something I couldn't name. His old filing cabinet was still there, tucked in the corner, its drawers smelling faintly of cedar and ink. I pulled out folders, one after another, until I found something buried in a file labeled Charity Miss. It was a draft of a trust agreement, one Walter and I had worked on years ago. It outlined protections for me, our home, a portion of the endowment, a say in the charity's future. But there, in the margins, was a newer note in Walter's hand. "Theo says this can be streamlined. He'll handle it." My stomach twisted. Streamlined. That word felt like a blade. Walter had been so weak toward the end, his mind clouded by pain and medication. Had Theo taken advantage of that? Had he stood over Walter's hospital bed, papers in hand, promising to handle everything? I closed the file, my hands shaking, but not from fear. It was resolved. Ellen called the next day with more. She'd reached out to a former colleague who'd worked under Theo at the charity. The colleague, nervous but willing to talk, said Theo had pushed to finalize the new will during Walter's last hospital stay. Meetings happened late at night, papers signed without the usual oversight. It felt rushed, the colleague said, like Theo didn't want anyone asking questions. Tom took this and ran with it. He drafted a motion to freeze the assets, a legal move to stop Theo from moving funds or property until we could investigate further. "This isn't about revenge, B," Tom said, his voice steady as he handed me the papers to review. "It's about protecting what Walter intended." I nodded, but inside, I felt a storm brewing. Protecting Walter's intentions meant protecting our love, our work, the life we'd poured into that charity. Filing the motion felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Theo would know I was fighting back. Part of me wondered if I was ready for what that would mean. I'd spent so long being the quiet one, the one who smoothed things over, who kept the peace, but sitting in Walter's study, surrounded by his books and his scent, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for me, I was fighting for him, for the promises we'd made to each other, for the legacy we'd dreamed of leaving behind. And yet, there was a weight I couldn't shake. Why hadn't Walter told me? Why had he let Theo get so close, close enough to rewrite our story? I looked at the trust draft again, at his careful handwriting, and felt a pang of guilt. Had I missed something? Had I been too busy caring for him to see what was happening right under my nose? I pushed the thought away. Guilt wouldn't help me now. I had Ellen, I had Tom, and I had Walter's words, tucked away in that notebook, whispering the truth. We were building something, a case, a fight, a chance to set things right. And I wasn't alone anymore. Have you ever had to pick up the pieces of a promise someone broke? That's where I was, standing in the middle of a life I thought I knew, gathering evidence like breadcrumbs, hoping they'd lead me back to the truth. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find something that would change everything. I couldn't stop thinking about that trust agreement, the one buried in Walter's filing cabinet with my name crossed out in red ink. It haunted me, not just because of what it meant, but because it felt like Walter was trying to tell me something. Even now, I'd spent so many nights wondering what he'd been thinking in those final months, why he'd kept his doubts about Theo to himself. But the more I dug, the more I felt his presence, his love still guiding me, like a hand reaching out through the fog. One evening, after another long call with Tom, I found myself back in Walter's study. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones. I wasn't looking for anything specific this time, just drawn to the space, to the shelves where Walter's favorite books sat, worn and loved. I pulled down his copy of The Great Gatsby, the one he'd read so many times the spine was cracked. He used to say it reminded him of chasing dreams, of holding on to things that slip away. I opened it, flipping through the pages, when something fell out, a single folded sheet of paper, tucked between chapters. My heart stopped. It was Walter's handwriting, faint but unmistakable, dated just 3 months before he passed. "B," it began. "If you're reading this, it means things have gone wrong. Theo's been pushing to change the trust. I don't trust his reasons, but I'm too tired to fight him. I've set up a separate fund for you, managed by Clara Newman. She knows everything. If Theo crosses the line, she'll know what to do. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I wanted to protect you from this." I read it again, my hands trembling, tears blurring the ink. Walter had known, he'd seen through Theo's polished promises, his late-night meetings, his talk of simplifying things, and he'd done something about it, even when he was too weak to fight. A fund, hidden away, just for me. I sat there, the book open in my lap, feeling him closer than I had in months. It wasn't just about the money, it was about his trust in me, his love, still alive in those words. Clara Newman was Walter's old friend, a retired journalist who'd covered the charity's early days. She was in her early 70s, with a sharp mind and a habit of asking questions others avoided. I called her the next morning, my voice unsteady as I explained what I'd found. "B," she said, calm but certain, "I've been waiting for this call. Walter came to me a year ago. He set up a trust fund for you, enough to keep you secure, to keep the charity's heart alive. He didn't want Theo to know." Then she dropped the bombshell. "There's more," she said. "I have a recording. Walter asked me to meet with him and Theo one night at the hospital. Theo thought I was just there to visit, but I recorded their conversation. Theo admitted he'd revised the will when Walter was too sick to argue. He said it was for the charity's future, but it was clear he wanted control." I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, piecing it together. Walter hadn't just left a letter. He'd left a weapon away to prove Theo's betrayal. Clara sent me the recording that afternoon, a grainy file that captured Theo's voice, smooth and calculated, saying, "It's better this way, Walter. You don't need to worry, be with the details." Walter's reply was faint, almost lost in the hum of hospital machines. "She deserves to know." I met Tom at his office the next day, the letter and recording in hand. He listened to the audio, his face unreadable at first, then breaking into a small, incredulous smile. "This is it, B," he said. "This isn't just suspicious. It's evidence of coercion." He drafted a motion to submit the recording and letter to the court, alongside our request to freeze the estate. It was a bold move, one that would force Theo to face what he'd done. But Theo wasn't done yet. That evening, a letter arrived from his attorney, all sharp words and veiled threats. They accused me of interfering with a lawful estate process, claimed I was driven by grief and confusion. They gave me 10 days to withdraw the motion or face legal consequences. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and set it beside my tea. I wasn't afraid anymore. Theo could threaten all he wanted, but I had Walter's words, Clara's recording, and the truth on my side. I stood by the window, looking out at the garden Walter and I had planted years ago. The roses were still there, stubborn against the autumn chill. Walter had always said they'd outlast us both, and maybe he was right, but I wasn't going to let his legacy, our legacy, be buried under Theo's ambition. I was done being silent. Have you ever held a secret that felt like it could change everything? That's what I held that night, a letter, a recording, and a spark of hope that Walter's love was still fighting for me. I didn't know how Theo would react, but I knew one thing: the truth was out now, and it wasn't going back in the dark. The gala was Theo's stage, and he played it like a master. The ballroom sparkled under chandeliers filled with the hum of polite conversation and the clink of wine glasses. It was a tribute to Walter, or so the invitation said, a night to honor his legacy with the charity. But as I stepped into the room, my heels clicking softly on the polished floor, I knew better. This wasn't about Walter. This was Theo claiming the spotlight, rewriting the story to make himself the hero. I'd dressed carefully that evening, not for show, but for myself. A navy dress Walter had loved, simple but elegant, with a silver brooch he'd given me for our 40th anniversary. It felt like armor, a quiet reminder of who I was. The room was crowded with familiar faces, members, donors, People who'd sat at our dining table over the years, laughing over Walter's terrible puns. But tonight, their smiles were polite, distant, like they weren't sure where I fit anymore. Theo stood at the center of it all, his suit tailored to perfection, his voice carrying over the crowd as he thanked everyone for their support. He spoke of Walter's vision, of the charity's future, of his role in carrying it forward. Every word was polished, practiced, but it felt hollow, like a speech written for someone else's life. I moved to a quieter corner, near a display table labeled Walter's Treasures. There, under glass, were pieces of Hima signed baseball from his college days, a first edition novel I'd bought him, his favorite pocket watch. My breath caught. Theo hadn't asked me. He'd taken these things from our home, put them up for auction like they were just props in his show. I touched the edge of the table, my fingers brushing the label that didn't mention my name. Something shifted inside me, not anger, not yet, but a steady resolve. I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to be seen. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope I'd prepared with Tom and Clara. Inside was a copy of Walter's letter, the one from The Great Gatsby, along with the summary of the recording where Theo admitted to altering the will. It was simple, unadorned, just the truth in black and white. I walked toward a board member, Harold, who'd known Walter since their college days. He was standing by the bar, sipping a drink, his face warm but tired. "Harold," I said softly, handing him the envelope, "you might want to see this." He looked confused, his brow furrowing, but he took it. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I nodded and stepped back, watching as he opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. He passed it to the woman next to him, another board member, and then to another. Across the room, Theo was still speaking, but his voice faltered for a split second when he noticed the envelope moving from hand to hand. His smile tightened, his hands pausing mid-gesture. I stood still, my heart steady, my eyes meeting his for just a moment. He looked away first. The room didn't erupt. There were no gasps, no dramatic confrontations, but I felt the air shifting, the weight of truth settling over the crowd like a quiet tide. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. I thanked Harold for the evening, adjusted my brooch, and walked out into the cool night air. The city hummed around me, alive with lights and sounds, but I felt something new, a lightness, like I'd set down a burden I'd carried too long. Theo had expected me to fade, to disappear into the grief he thought would silence me. But I hadn't. I'd shown up, not with anger, but with the truth, and it was enough to crack the story he'd tried to write. As I drove home, the windows cracked to let in the autumn breeze. I thought of Walter. I thought of his letter, his voice in that recording, still reaching out to protect me. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was Walter's wife, his partner, his equal, and I was done letting someone else tell our story. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt like you were finally seen? That's what that night was for me, a moment of reclaiming, not just my place, but my voice. And it wasn't over yet. The days after the gala felt different, like the world had softened around the edges. The air was quieter, the kind of quiet that doesn't weigh you down but lifts you up. Theo didn't call. No letters from his lawyer, no sharp emails demanding explanations. A week later, Clara forwarded me a press release from the charity's board. Theo had stepped down as executive director, citing a need to preserve the foundation's reputation and honor Walter's legacy. No admission of guilt, no apology, just a polished exit. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. The truth had done its work. The board appointed a temporary committee, people who'd known Walter from the beginning, who'd sat in our living room dreaming up ways to fund scholarships and community programs. They reached out to me, not as a formality, but with warmth, asking if I'd consult on restoring Walter's original vision. I said yes, not because I needed a title, but because I wanted his heart to live on in the work we'd started together. One afternoon, while sorting through Walter's old files, I found another letter. It was tucked inside a folder, labeled Charity Goals, written in his careful, familiar hand. It began, "You were always the soul of this work. If anything happens to me, keep it alive. Not for money or fame, but for the people we wanted to help. You'll know how." My eyes stung as I read it, not from sadness, but from a kind of gratitude. Walter hadn't just left me a fund or a legacy. He'd left me a purpose, one that was mine to carry forward. I went to a small event at the charity a few weeks later, a quiet lunch for longtime donors. The room was simple, no chandeliers, no polished speeches, just round tables, coffee, and stories about Walter's early days. I wore the silver brooch he'd given me, pinned to a soft gray sweater, and, for the first time in months, I felt like I belonged. Near the end, a young board member, Sarah, took the stage. She was new, but her voice carried a warmth that reminded me of Walter. She spoke about the charity's roots, about the dreams that built it, and then she said my name, B. Langley. She said, looking right at me, helped shape this foundation from the start. Her strength has reminded us what we're here for. The room turned toward me, their applause soft but steady, like a heartbeat. I stood, just for a moment, and nodded. Not for recognition, but for Walter, for us, for the truth that had finally found its way back. That evening, I walked through the garden Walter and I had planted behind our house. The roses were still there, their petals curling against the late autumn chill. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the soil, and planted a few new bulbs, daffodils, for spring. Walter used to say gardens were promises, proof that life keeps going even when you can't see it yet. I thought about that as I worked, the earth cool under my hands. I wasn't just planting flowers, I was planting hope, for me, for him, for the future we'd always believed in. I went inside, lit a candle in the kitchen, and sat by the window with a cup of tea. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It was full of Walter's laughter, our late-night talks, the dreams we'd shared. Theo had tried to erase me, but he couldn't erase us. I'd taken back my place, not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet, steady truth. And in that truth, I'd found peace. If you've ever felt pushed out of your own story, like your name was crossed off a page you helped write, know this. The truth has a way of finding its way back. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it just waits, patient and sure, until you're ready to claim it. For me, that truth was Walter's love, his trust, and the life we built together. It was enough to carry me home. And here's the lesson I've carried with me. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the ones you win with loud battles or courtroom drama. They're the quiet ones, the moments when you stand in your own truth, surrounded by the echoes of those who loved you. Hold on to that. Plant your own bulbs, even in the cold. They'll bloom when the time is right.